today. I should sort of say I've been on sort of reefs, I've been in hibernation, so I'm re-socialising myself. You're the most people I've seen for a long time. But it's a pleasure to come and speak about my research because it's new. As Martin said, my research today has looked at gentrification and the effects of gentrification on working class communities. But I'm going to talk about research on evictions, contemporary eviction processes, which builds on that. So here are just, how do I do it? Is it right? How does that just go naturally on the next one? Thank you. Can I move this? So these are just a few headlines from the past few months in the UK. I'll move myself, it's probably easier. Evictions are every day in the UK, 170 a day to be precise. The Ministry of Justice has released figures on, and that's happening at the same year in which the Conservative government has made a commitment to advance home ownership further and cut social housing even further. So we have a quote from George Osborne there. And it's not limited to the UK either. You know, the evictions are every day, but they're everywhere. We can see them in unprecedented growth in neoliberal countries such as Germany, Ireland. In the US, some of you might be familiar with Matthew Desmond's recent book on evictions that recently came out. So how did we get here? That's really a central concern of mine in my research. And I researched gentrification since 2005, so transcending different political and economic conditions, different governments, pre and post crash and austerity. And what I would attest to is an evolution in this time from what was called state-led gentrification to state-led evictions. Now, to premise this a little, in pre-crash times, displacement and evictions weren't a widespread outcome of gentrification. Social housing, secure tenancies and welfare provisions, which were born out of the reforms following the rent strikes in 1914, were a vital buffer to tenants against the vagaries of the market and housing. They delivered this statutory protection from evictions for much of the 20th century. But instead, my research pre-crash was looking at how the project of gentrification was trying to involve working class residents to get their participation, to make them become better housing consumers of private goods, to become homeowners. And this state-led gentrification was targeting poor places, poor neighbourhoods as part of regeneration efforts. So I was looking at how the working class subject was being altered rather than being displaced. It was under New Labour, meritocracy, things can only get better. You know, you can dream of owning your own home, but as that neoliberal project advanced, we saw this coercive side emerge, and following the financial crash, there's been an unprecedented commodification of housing and a decline in welfare. So these urban regeneration efforts, they still target poor people and poor places, but they're not encouraging these people and places to be better consumers or be more productive. The gloves are off when this project hits a limit, as it would in a global recessionary period. Values extracted through housing privatisation, through a different means, and it's just through the removal and displacement of those people. So in the post-crash context, housing has become this global financial product, and the subsequent austerity project, which is an intense political project which extends the economy of debt to the individual. It's removed housing protection, and we've got this really stark divide between housing wealth and housing poverty. This divide is not simply created by the market, it's created by government policy and practice. Where welfare reforms have increased the profitability in housing industry, it's simultaneously forced thousands of households into rent arrears. And this is what I conceive as the process of state-led evictions. That's why I use this term. Now I'm going to explain in more detail what I mean about this in the paper, but I define state-led eviction as the cumulative impacts of these government cuts in social support for housing and the promotion of these housing market activities, which not only create eviction risk, but through these kind of legal repossession frameworks, they actively endorse evictions. So state-led eviction, it comprises two aspects that we've identified in our recent research. The first relates to a transference of debt achieved through austerity and welfare cuts, which affects directly housing benefit payments and therefore people's ability to pay their rent. And the second refers to a transference of wealth to the private sector. Now this includes the general expansion of the private sector in housing, but it also, and I'm going to, as I focus on in this paper, it involves how the state works in partnership with bailiff and enforcement companies, and they then profit from household debt, displacement and eviction, so it becomes this eviction industry. So this work's based on recent research in the UK on eviction and welfare reforms with my colleague Vicky Cooper in Open University. And we've been looking at the reforms that are taking place, but also interviews with housing activists in the UK as well. We're just trying to look at the form and nature of the changes taking place, because the state is no longer the protector in housing, they've become the profiteer, and we're seeking to kind of shed light on this process, because that's a key change in its role for much of the 20th century. And we need to do this to really effectively mobilise resistance in housing. Resistance has to be almost like as radical or more radical than the rent strikes were previously, but it can't take that form since the forms of evictions and the forms of inequality are different as well. And I end by kind of thinking about how we might do that and how we might build an effective platform for resistance in housing. So, okay, to understand how we kind of got here today, we have to consider the evolution in gentrification. So it's probably useful for me to be kind of clear about the role it plays. And I don't know how familiar you are with the gentrification debates, but there's been a lot of tussles over the years, definitional tussles about whether it's a cultural-led process or whether it's an economic-led process. Broadly, gentrification, I think, can be described as capitalism playing out in the landscape. It's essentially the economy in urban form. So capitalism evolves, so does gentrification. So it's no mere kind of chaotic neighbourhood process or driven by hipsters that are there kind of getting the scapegoat, is getting the blame as the driver of gentrification at the moment. It mediates urban restructuring towards neoliberal market capitalism. And this is because land is central to the functioning of capitalism, which echoes David Harvey's long-standing position of the significance of land, second circuit capitalism, and accumulation by dispossession. And in this, the key mechanism for profit and exploitation is through rent, land rent. So rent occupies this key source of value and profit. So without any sufficient regulation from the state in the functioning of the housing market, exploitation will occur. So state-led gentrification, as I've used that term a few times, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but it's the most recent kind of incarnation of gentrification is described by the late Marxist geographer Neil Smith. He says it's the urban frontier and kind of getting this value and profit from rent. So in this definition of gentrification, it recognises the active role that the states play in, along with the market, to drive gentrification. And we can see this in how it became institutionalised in urban policy. Gentrification was this panacea to decline wrought by deindustrialisation. It was wholeheartedly subsumed within new Labour policy in the 2000s under the Urban Renaissance banner. So gentrification is not like a process that's just driven by economic forces, it is part of kind of policy. But then the very project of state-led gentrification was momentarily challenged by the financial crisis, 2007-2008, which was itself precipitated by a collapse in housing finance and real estate. The financial system rebounded, finding new ways to extract profit and value without producing in a more kind of traditional sense. So generating profit in this manner then involved a shift in a mode of governing in which the imperatives of finance and private capital take precedence. So the new financial governance we saw emerging can really be captured through housing and how that changed. Now Raquel Rolnick, the UN Rapporteur for Housing, identified this change following the crash as triggering a global paradigm shift in housing, where housing changed from being a social entity to a financial entity. And this financialisation of housing is characterised by a large-scale state withdrawal from the housing sector, alongside a simultaneous creation of policies which support a market-based housing model. So housing gets repositioned as a primary commodity and global finance investment asset. So in the post-crash context, state-led gentrification then performs a greater rather than lesser role in the political economy. So gentrification was then the spatial manifestation of these neoliberal policies before the crash. It's the management and exploitation of individuals in the housing sector which starts to become this new frontier under financial capitalism. So this sees the removal of state protection, which was a buffer in eviction through much of the 20th century. And this is evident in the post-crash UK housing policies, prioritisation of finance and private capital. The presence of land and rent and capital accumulation is supported through a whole host of housing policies, but no less through the retrenchment of welfare in the UK today. So previous to this paradigm shift that Raquel Rolnick identifies, social housing played this really important role in offsetting and protecting tenants through much of the 20th century. So I mentioned the rent strikes and the Rent Restrictions Act in 1915 that followed that was pivotal in regulating tenancies and providing secure tenancies. But there's been an erosion of that, almost coming full circle in the 100 years since that was implemented, where the private sector has become the dominant housing provider, and social housing is only provided on a kind of emergency only basis, as Patrick and Pawson identified. So the state becomes, as I said, the profiteer rather than the protector. There's laxer housing regulations, lack of rent controls, and unbridled transnational capital that's been pumped into the property market, which have all kind of created these eviction hotspots that we can see in the UK and other places as well. So I see this as culminating what we're trying to identify in research and make sense of this is, we've used this term state-led eviction, and we see this as comprising two aspects. Now the first relates to the changing, the changing nature of welfare under austerity measures implemented following the crash, which involves this redistribution of public debt from the from the state level to the individual level as a means of trying to resolve this financial deficit. And this transference of debt involves a reduction in welfare expenditure and a support for social housing, but also sees then the creation of personal debt, payday loans, borrowing and arrears that people are taking to meet this growing cost in rent, private rents. But the second aspect of state-led evictions is also about actively promoting the private sector as the dominant source of housing. And in doing so, this has led to a redistribution of wealth where public funds are now literally transferred over into the private rented market. So, for example, it's been claimed from 2012 to 2014, £35 billion of housing benefits, which are public funds, have been spent in private rented sectors that are given to private landlords. So the rise in demand and rent rates in private sector is not necessarily about a state withdrawal, but a very different kind of state activity. And this activity encompasses strategies around enforcements of dispossession, supported by growing legal repossession frameworks that involve private business as well. So And what follows, what I'm going to go into, just checking often don't have my slides in order, and what follows I'm going to lay out the changing nature of the state and eviction process, which is based on this research, as I said, and we've been undertaking with some secondary data analysis of welfare changes, but also some qualitative interviews that we've been carrying out in London and in Liverpool as well. We've been speaking with E15 focused mothers, but also love activists in Liverpool as well. And there's been a lot of kind of high profile activity that's been taking place that I'm sure you're aware of, even rent strikes as well by the students in London, which have had some purchase too, so we've been talking to these groups. And I'm going to think about as well the challenges this has raised on how to fight these kind of different emerging kind of processes, this new frontier of housing inequality that's emerging. So, the paradigmatic changes in housing we are conceiving conceptually has been tantamount to this redistribution of wealth and debt in housing. So this transference of debt, this begins with a shift in how tenants are becoming the recipients of welfare to the recipients of debt. So in 2012, these kind of historic welfare reforms were ushered in by the Liberal Democrat coalition, Conservative coalition government. And one of the most controversial and pernicious was undoubtedly the bedroom tax, which was the spare room subsidy tax on a housing benefit that was levied at social housing tenants deemed to have this spare room. So a year after the bedroom tax was implemented, research found that 2/3 of households in England were affected by the bedroom tax had fallen into arrears, while 1 in 7 received eviction letters and faced losing their homes. So I think it's around 6% of benefit claimants affected by the bedroom tax we know have moved as a result. Now the bedroom tax has been facing quite a strong legal challenge because of this in court. But a more pervasive and probably a more wide-reaching changes have actually been introduced through the benefit cap or the universal credit, because this limits the total weekly income an individual or family will receive in their weekly welfare payments. Now, I'm going to explain how this works. So when a household exceeds the set level, their benefit is capped. And now this cap is administered primarily through housing benefit payments. Therefore, household rent is what's affected when these cuts come in. So it's estimated that 50,000 households have lost around £93 per week, and 15% are losing around £150 a week. So these households then have to make up that subsequent shortfall that they face in rent. So given the cap is administered primarily through housing benefits, we would argue that it should be called a rent cap, because that's where it's coming in, because it automatically reduces the person's income and rent. In many ways, I think this is more sinister than the bedroom tax, because it's more widespread and there's actually less challenge or recourse legally that the bedroom tax has had. So those in poverty and receiving welfare benefits are then facing the greatest challenges in relation to rent, and therefore they're facing the greatest risk of evictions. The inability of households receiving welfare benefits to pay rent has seen hundreds and thousands of households fall into rent arrears. That's the main cause of arrears, which is the main cause of evictions at the moment in the UK. So from 2007 to 2013, the number of arrears increased by 130%. And these arrears have resulted in these unprecedented levels of repossessions and evictions. And the transference of debt is not limited to welfare benefit cuts. It also relates to how housing tenure is increasingly privatised. Given the growth of the private rented sector and the shrinking of investment in social housing, the coalition government has introduced the Localism Act, which allows local authorities to house the poorest households in private rented sector despite the rent inflation that's taken place in this sector. So in 2012 and 2013, 115 repossession orders were granted to evict tenants in private rented accommodation as a result of rent arrears, and these tenants are getting shifted over in the private rented sector through policy. Furthermore, once those tenants are removed from their property and they become homeless, they're deemed intentionally homeless, because that's the category if you can't pay your rent, and thus they're refused full duty and housing support unless they can satisfy local authority that they took the appropriate measures and support to deal with their debt problem. In England and Wales, more than 43,000 households in rent accommodation were evicted by county court bailiffs in the past 12 months, and that's a 58% increase in the past 4 years. The highest levels recorded since 2001. That's for some reason when records have begun in recording evictions, but I want to stress these are county court bailiff figures, and I'm going to come back to that because they're not the only evictions that are taking place. They're getting High Court enforcement officers are also undertaking evictions, and we're not counting those evictions, and I'll get onto that in a second. So these changes in welfare and housing tenure are therefore distinct, but they're interrelated modes of transferring debt to the individual and redistributing wealth into the private sector, and as a result exposing the most vulnerable to a volatile housing market and risk of evictions. And there's more of this yet to come, because this month in the UK the Welfare Reform and Work Bill comes into effect, and that's reducing the benefit cap even further. So again, there's going to be more people facing this eviction risk period as their the cap reduces and the rent income reduces as well. And this worried one of our campaigners that we spoke to. People that are working in this field said, you know, you ain't seen nothing yet. This is really going to explode in the next year or two as that reduction comes in bedroom terms. Have I got the quote there yet? So he's saying the groups as well that are going to be most affected are families with kids, because that's where the cap is going to be focused on those groups. So in addition to this, the government's new housing and planning bill actively curtails housing choice by further privatising the housing sector. This bill, and it's been discussed, it proposes to replace the obligation to build homes for social rent with a duty to build starter homes. It's going to extend the right to buy, and it's going to compel local authorities to sell off any high value housing, and it also introduced laxer planning permission. So these two bills capture this paradigm shift, as I mentioned, in housing from a socialised to a financialised entity. The changes taking place denote also another critical dimension in state-led evictions. Not just this transfer of debt to the individual, but the transfer of funds to the private sector who are profiteering from evictions. Business is booming in this sector. So this is the other aspect that we've kind of tried to conceptualise, this transfers of wealth to the private sector, and that occurs, as I said, through the retraction of social housing and the expansion of the housing market. But within this, one aspect involves how governments are working in partnerships with these enforcement businesses, primarily to free up market value of housing. So private businesses can profit from the dispossession of the poor, and this is being facilitated by the state. We see this has been tantamount to an eviction industry. And we refer to this practice as accumulation by repossession. So it starts with David Harvey's notion of accumulation by dispossession on how predatory capitalism operates at key points during an economic recession. So dispossession entails the loss of rights and this erosion allows for a greater flexibility around capital accumulation. But this accumulation by repossession refers to the ways in which rent arrears and the ultimate consequence of that, evictions, not only lead to dispossession and displacement of tenants, but allows for businesses to profit and expand in an industry that is based upon poverty and housing inequality. So this eviction industry, that we argue, comprises these private companies that profit from enforcing possession orders, as well as the legislative frameworks that protect them. So these can include, for example, credit consumer agencies that lend to tenants to make up their rent shortfall, but also the bailiff companies that take back what is subsequently owed, and these enforcement agencies that carry out evictions. Business is booming for them. So to illustrate this, when landlords and housing authorities want to evict tenants, this is dealt with as a civil matter, where repossessions are made at the county court level. So that's where those big Ministry of Justice figures that have come in at 170 evictions a day. It's county court bailiffs that are enforcing those. However, there's been a rise in the number of high court claims that have been made to carry out evictions by these high court enforcement agencies. They carry out evictions more efficiently because they're paid by result. So these enforcement officers, will work hard to enforce these repossessions in order to get paid. Now, one of the largest high court enforcement and bailiff companies are the Sheriff's Office Limited, and they are a profitable and successful enforcement business, and so much so that they were awarded Enforcement Team of the Year by the Chartered Institute of Credit Management Awards. I think it was a £4,000 table dinner ceremony type thing, and some of them going in there, and there was some protests outside. And they point out how well they're doing. The chief executive there says, we launched a number of specialised services and entered into new markets, all leading to the growth in sectors of our business. And I can't play the clip, it was crashing the slides, but there's a clip advising how best efficiently and profitably to remove your tenants from your property by using the High Court enforcement route. So the role of eviction industry, I think, is really crucial when we think about the complexity of this state-led evictions. Although run by private companies, bailiffs and enforcement officers have a range of legal powers as court officials, allowing them to break entry into people's homes and remove people from premises. These legal powers present some challenges to mobilising resistance against rent arrears and eviction. People actively obstructing the duties carried out by these court officers can be prosecuted, and given the range of powers and legal protection, bailiff and enforcement companies are a key force in state-led evictions, where any challenges to this authority can be met by prosecution. And the operation of evictions, this eviction industry, help us realise the full might of the state and the dispossession of tenants who fall into arrears, because we can see this kind of hybrid use of civil and criminal legislation to forcibly remove them. Police presence also at these evictions play a critical role, because it's not uncommon for them to be there. But evictions are civil incidents, not criminal, and in principle the role of the police in these matters should be to maintain independence. However, in research with activists who are present at evictions reveals that police do not maintain an independent position. Furthermore, they have this symbolic effect on perceptions. As one participant explains here, there's a wider problem around housing and the police, in the sense that they're civil matters, so they shouldn't be involved in the police, but when the police are involved, they take the side of the landlord, as their role is to intervene with eviction, and it's a civil matter. So the police role in eviction and the notion of evictions kind of compounds it as being state-led. as this participant alludes to, their presence can lead to tenants and communities to believe that the occupiers have committed a criminal offence when no such things taking place. Indeed, it exposes the failure of police to really act independently as they side with the landlord and bailiffs taking out carrying out evictions. And this hybrid use of criminal and civil legislation really represents a challenge to the counter-hegemonic response in housing inequality. As well, evictions are foremost a civil matter. Any resistance or obstruction to the official authorities can have these punitive ramifications. So I'm going to consider some of these kind of counter-hegemonic responses to evictions and what's going on, which relates to our research. Because with this growth of evictions, we've seen a corresponding growth in housing activism in the UK. And this comprises real kind of diverse groups of tenants associations, unions, charities, and community activist groups. And these disparate groups collaborate on a range of resistance activities, such as lobbying campaigns against revenge evictions, welfare cuts, and more general awareness raising activities as well. Now, given the rise in household rents and ergo evictions, one of the most common activities has not been rent strikes, but it's actually been eviction watches. Now these involve volunteers coming together to actively block bailiffs as they come to evict tenants. And I mean, this is understandably a temporary measure, but it's often carried out if there's families or vulnerable tenants, and it's often just to kind of buy a bit of time in order for more kind of secure housing to be put in place for that tenant to move to. What's interesting is, like, in lieu of previous statutory protection provided by the state, born of rent strikes and rent regulations 100 years ago, these volunteer bodies are the kind of almost the physical buffer or barrier now to evictions that was once provided by the state. But there's also a kind of resistance has varied. Inequality commonly identified amongst the group is rent, both social and private rent, and problems around affordability. And as such, one of the most referenced resistance activities is the possibility of again implementing rent strikes or rent strikes work. That comes up again, and one participant told us that their campaign group was researching rent strikes to assess whether they could be used. Says, with the Glasgow rent strikes, that just seemed the best fun, pulling down your bailiff's pants and ringing bells if anyone's going to be evicted. Now, this renewed interest in rent strikes may be warranted given the success of a recent rent strike by students in London last year who were protesting about the general really poor quality accommodation conditions, and they withheld their rent. Now, then the university threatened to withhold their end-of-year results, but then they later capitulated and awarded the students compensation to the sum of 1 month's rent. So what the success of this rent strike demonstrates is how a common housing tenure shared by tenants of a collective social group, students, could mobilise this resistance against the owners of that property. So that's what aided this strike's success. But housing composition in general is more widely diverse, so could that be implemented in the same way or more kind of national level with the same effect? Now, given the activities of the state in relation to welfare cuts and the eviction industry, rent strikes are an important strategy, but it would not be the only one, since housing has been attacked on these very diverse fronts. A key issue is that rent strikes wouldn't be the most viable option for benefit claimants, particularly those in the private rented sector whose rent is first and foremost paid by the government, and so it challenges this idea. So the diversity around housing tenure is a consequence of neoliberal restructuring over the last 3 decades, which has fragmented housing tenure, And simultaneously, it's kind of divided the class struggle. So you've got this kind of class decomposition and dispossession, poor quality of work, low pay, no pay churn, which traps people on benefits and positions them at the kind of greatest risk of poverty. So today's landscape of class housing poverty means that we really kind of require a much diverse and kind of resistance movement. Particularly too because there's regional variation as well in the UK, which poses another kind of challenge as well. So the diversity of the counter-hegemonic movement and uneven experience of housing inequality amongst even these groups of activists themselves creates the risk of fighting on kind of divided fronts. Now, without a doubt, this movement has helped bring housing inequality into kind of mainstream party politics and public discussion. But the complexity of housing inequality raises a question for the activists we spoke to. As said here, one of the union members from GMB says, we argued like hell over what was a priority. You have people like, do we take the members who've been looking to buy their own home or want to own but can't afford it? And what about council tenants facing evictions? I think there's a recognition of problem across the housing network and the union movement about what the actual end goals are. Because they're working within a union and they're thinking, you know, what's our best fight? But they're working also with Generation Rent, who are speaking particularly to rent affordability issues, who are then working alongside groups like E15 Focus Mothers and Defend Council Housing, who have different agendas and different issues that they're trying to address. So given the diverse nature of housing inequalities and the increasing role of the state in facilitating these, universal end goal in the movement is still to be developed. So to conclude, I conclude in a kind of optimistic note, but what we're trying to look at in this research is how the frontier in housing privatisation inequality has advanced, and therefore it's paramount that we begin to conceptualise this entire ensemble of actions that comprise this frontier in this state-led eviction that's taking place. And the state is active in these processes like never before, whether it's enforcing evictions or it's retracting housing benefits. All of these activities are contributing today to extracting profit and making evictions permissible. And that is important ramifications for how we're going to resist these inequalities today. So the question remains where and how such resistance strategies can leverage the most power given the tenor of changes like we've been highlighting. How state-led eviction facilitates this transference of debt achieved through recent welfare cuts, which directly affects rent affordability, and also facilitates the transfer of wealth into from social housing into the private sector. Because these changes are exposing the most vulnerable, as I said, to a volatile housing market, because they've got to face this shortfall in rent and face this greatest risk of eviction. And the state plays this key role, but it's also through this kind of shared interest that it has with these enforcement businesses and the hybrid use of civil and criminal legislation to forcibly remove these tenants for profitable aims. Now, these changes in housing policy and state-led activities really raise the key questions for housing activism and where we might go. Because the protests around rent strikes is really kind of grounded in a kind of previous hegemonic project where the state was acting as a kind of intermediary in housing between the tenant and the market. Rent strikes won't work when the state is not playing that role anymore. They've shifted so that they don't have that kind of leverage. But despite the diversification of housing inequality and the role of the state in facilitating evictions, one thing does remain is that rent matters. It's crucial and therefore should be at the forefront of resistance in the same way it's at the forefront of exploitation that's taking place. But just how as the state is complexly active in extracting profit from the most vulnerable, we require corresponding diverse tactics. And I think this is highlighted by Stuart Hawkinson and Lawrence in their assessment of housing crisis under neoliberalisation. And they're calling for a genuine cross-tenure housing movement that mobilises every point of housing precarity, overcrowding, homelessness, unaffordable rents and mortgages, unfit conditions, ruthless private landlords, privatisation, housing and welfare benefit cuts, homeowners and mortgage arrears, or facing repossession. Yes, there's a lot of ground to cover. When facing this kind of new brutality, for it is a new brutality in housing inequality in the 21st century, where the state transfers debt and wealth in new ways, I think we need to be kind of armed and united in kind of new ways, which we currently aren't. So there's, yes, a big challenge ahead. So I will leave it there with unanswered questions rather than answers.